Right into it. All right, so welcome back for Hacking Pro Tips interview number 4. I'm honored to have Adam Bacchus today, new team member to HackerOne, right, as of May. And I think that first week, Martin put us into contact, and you started providing edits on the book, which a lot of people have gone ahead and purchased. So that was kind of cool. And coming out of that, I thought we'd do a quick interview. So with that, I guess we'll do a brief intro in terms of those that are unfamiliar. But you were previously with Google and Snapchat, both doing bug bounties, and now you're leading up the internet bug bounty with HackerOne, right?
Yep, that's correct.
So in terms of your time at Google and Snapchat, you want to just give us kind of a quick overview what it was like there, what your role was?
Sure, yeah. So overall, my background, fresh out of college, I was consulting for 4 years. So I was doing pen testing, things like that. At Google, I did a variety of things. So I worked on vulnerability management. I helped with the internal pen test program a bit. As you mentioned, I helped run the bug bounty program. And right before I left, I worked on detection and response. So Snapchat, I was down there for about a year before I came to HackerOne, and same sort of thing, internal security for the most part, and helped run their bug bounty program as well.
Okay, nice, nice. That I'm always interested in that, and one of the reasons why I wanted to actually do the interview was because, and this kind of came up in our emails. I saw it being on that end of triaging as like this gold mine of information. Like it's just I just envision it as like you just get reports and you're just the constant learning curve is huge. But one of the things we talked about was kind of there's that, but then there's also a lot of noise, and then kind of the acting as the intermediary between, say, developers and kind of the hacker community. So I thought it was good for us to kind of to jump in there. Um, and now, when we were talking, it came up that you had found cross-site scripting vulnerability on one of the Google acquisitions, and that kind of opened the door to you to Google. I don't know exactly how it all played out, but Martin also mentioned that you did some hacking on the side. So I was just kind of curious if you could tell us a little bit about that. You still looking and checking out stuff?
Yeah, I don't poke around nearly as much as I used to. I've gotten more towards the project management side of things,
Okay.
but I can talk a little bit about that story. So at the time I was consulting, and I stumbled upon a cross-site scripting bug in one of Google's acquisitions. So this was right before they had started their bug bounty program. So
Okay.
unfortunately, I did not get a bounty as a result of my report. But I was able to have some back and forth with a fellow over there whose name was also Adam Meehan, and he is actually the guy who started Google's bug bounty program.
Oh,
So essentially, through that, I managed to bump into him at Black Hat. We had a few beers, and it was like a year after that or so. He ended up referring me. That's basically how I got my foot in the door. So I actually owe my job to a bug bounty-esque type of interaction.
nice, nice. That's great. So when you were doing that, we're just gonna before I know we're gonna get into triaging, but I'm always interested when I'm talking with other hackers, how you got started. So what was it that kind of got you going? Like, why were you looking at the acquisition?
Sure, yeah. I guess I can go back even further in time, probably when I was like 11 years old and the movie Hackers came out, the really crappy movie with Angelina Jolie. You know what I'm talking about, right? And and I saw that, I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool. And I actually didn't really get too into information security. Even in college, there were only a few classes that I took that were related to it. And when I interviewed around, I had a friend who was in ACM, which is essentially the Computer Geek Club Association for Computing Machinery. And he helped me get my first gig out of college, which was consulting. So I was there for about 6 months, and then I jumped ship to another consulting firm. I was there for about 4 years. And most of what I learned, I actually learned on the job from my peers.
And that was so that would have been formal pen testing, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so I've talked to others as well, but I've never really dug into this. Do you find there's a difference between, say, when you're on your own, you're hacking, and the formal pen testing? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's huge, huge difference. So in general, the difference I would say between pen testing, like formal pen testing consulting with a company, with a contract and all of that versus bug bounty programs, with consulting, it's a lot more rigid, it's a lot more fixed. So you usually have some sort of legal agreement in place. I can tell you one story. I won't be able to name the client, but this client I was consulting for, they would only let us test them from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on Sundays. And no automated scans, just
Yeah.
manual testing only. So yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, no, I was gonna say like that. It's a 4 hour window out of a week, right? Like,
Yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible. And so every Sunday for like a month, me and four other consultants would get together. We'd order like pizza and Red Bull and just like go at it for 4 hours and scramble to find as much as we could.
yeah,
So they can be a little more. It can be a little more restrictive, and it's not. Of course, that's an extreme example.
yeah,
It's not always like that with consulting, but I find that there are a lot more rules and regulations in place. Oftentimes, companies do consulting for like compliance purposes, like PCI, things like that.
yeah,
Whereas bug bounty programs, typically the expectations are a little more reasonable than that.
yeah,
I'm sure you know this, and for anyone who's just getting into it, you can look. Most companies have a rules page or like a scope page where they say, here are the domains that you can hack on that we consider in scope for the program. Please don't socially engineer us. Don't try to sneak into our office name spawn style.
yeah, yeah,
Don't do shady things. Like don't go after other users, things like that. So
yeah.
it seems like there's a lot more freedom, and for companies it's beneficial as well because they're essentially paying only for the results.
Okay.
Whereas with consulting, like yeah, there I could talk for a while about consulting versus bug bounty.
Nice. No, that's
I'll-
I'm always curious, and you hear a lot of people talking about it. And then I've also read like there's, when you're doing it with the team, sometimes you choose which tools you're going to use, and it won't necessarily be the same tools per project. And so it's always interesting. And then a lot of times, like the hackers that I have talked to that have that formal experience, like they're the guys that sometimes go really deep, and they end up finding like crazy remote code executions and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if it's the methodology that you learn doing that, or is this just the exposure, the practice? What would your thoughts be on it?
Yeah, I think you learn quite a bit when you come from a formal pen testing background. I think one other big difference you see is what it looks like on the inside of the network. So for bug bounty programs, at least what I've seen, it seems mostly focused on application security and testing from the outside and black box testing. Whereas if you're a pen tester, if you're a consultant, you might actually be put on the internal network and say, let's just assume
Oh,
you're a malicious employee. What can you get from here? Like, what do we have on the inside of our network?
yeah,
Or you might even be given like the source code of an application, things like that. And sometimes that happens if you have a bug bounty participant that you really trust. Maybe you'll share your source code with them.
oh,
And I know that Google does some things like that as well. So they do, I forget the exact terminology, but it's kind of like a research grant where
okay,
they basically say, here's a fixed chunk of money. We're going to give it to you. We'd like you to focus on this unreleased feature or just this one particular product for a period of time. If you find anything, awesome. We'll pay you a bounty like we normally do.
yeah,
If not, then no harm, no foul. Thanks for taking a focused look at that one piece of software.
huh, oh, that's crazy. I never thought of that, and I actually never heard of that either.
Mhm.
So that's interesting, because
Yeah,
that would give you a whole different perspective, right? So
yeah,
the same thing is kind of going like there are a few bounty programs on the different platforms that give you access to like a GitHub account, and
right.
ask you to go through that. So yeah, interesting.
And the thing you said about teams too, it's kind of interesting. Normally you think of consulting as teams, and sometimes that is the case. But with bug bounties, I've actually seen teams participate in bug bounty programs as well.
Oh, really?
Which is, yeah, it's pretty interesting. So you might have like 4 or 5 people all coming from the same email address, but you find out that it's a team of people, and they actually just split the bounties amongst themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And you've seen that kind of at your time with Google?
Yeah, I saw that. I think maybe like once at Google, there was one group of people. I don't know too much about them, and I probably couldn't say even if I did.
Yeah.
But it is kind of interesting just to see that there are some teams out there that approach bug bounties as a team and kind of split up the bounties.
Yeah, I know. Talking with different hackers and that kind of thing. Like obviously there's. I don't think it's private because Ben's tweeted about it 1,000 times. But he started a hacker chat on Skype where there's a lot of researchers that are there talking as well. And I think he's mentioned a couple times that like in the chat sometimes an issue will come up and then a couple guys will just kind of private message each other and kind of work through that together. So you see that as well. And then on Twitter, you sometimes see people tweeting out, and I've done it as well. Kind of, I found this. Does anybody know how to exploit it? Type thing. Yeah, crazy. Um, so we kind of covered off kind of a little bit of your background. But I'm curious when you were kind of doing your own hacking and say even looking at the Google acquisition, um, was there any methodology that you had that you specifically applied to targeting something, or did you just go buck wild and
So I don't know how much I can say about it because I was consulting for a client at a time at the time, and so we obviously had NDAs and stuff in place with them.
Yeah.
And that particular example, I more or less just stumbled upon that one. Um, I guess it's been fixed for a really long time, so it's probably okay to talk about it. But essentially, it was a cross-site scripting bug in Postini,
Yeah.
which is used for like spam filtering and things like that. And so I was testing cross-site scripting for a client, and it involved something to do with mail. I won't get into too much specifics, but basically we were using Postini at the time.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, what happened to this email? It's like, oh, it's in the quarantine. It got quarantined by Postini. And then I go into Postini and the alert popped. And I'm like, oh, hey. I was not expecting that to happen.
Yeah.
Uh, but I guess overall, in terms of methodology for pen testing, usually you have a checklist of things that you usually go through. It depends if you're testing just one specific application or if you're attacking the whole external perimeter to see what you can do and if you can get to the inside and pivot and things like that. But yeah, for bug bounties, I think it really varies from person to person. Everybody has their own strengths and their own things that they kind of go after.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really important if you're a bug bounty program to have a variety of hackers with their different skill sets hacking on your stuff. I guess that's one more benefit you get from a program versus consulting.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. That's come up in other interviews as well. Kind of talking about people's expertise with cross-site scripting and some of the wild stuff they can do, as opposed to others like Philippe that I interviewed in my last interview, focusing on Facebook's API and some of the stuff that he's been doing there with information disclosure. But he's also looking at, say, reverse engineering now. And I know that for myself, I'm more comfortable right now looking at like application logic. So do people have their code in the back end set up properly for team permissions and whatnot? I just end up having to defaulting to it because I feel more comfortable with it. But always curious how others approach it, and then that opportunity to kind of branch out because there are others that are out there that are doing kind of like across the board hacking.
Mhm.
So in our conversations, a couple things that have come up when we were talking about the book, and I've updated the chapter based on the conversation that we've had for submitting reports and whatnot. But really, as I mentioned, I thought there was this gold mine of information when you were on the back end triaging reports. It's evidently not always the case. There's a lot of noise there. I was kind of curious if you could kind of speak to that for the people that are new that are going to be listening to this. What does that look like? Like, what's the experience like receiving these reports, having to work with an engineering team, and why does it sometimes take weeks? Why does it sometimes take days? What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind as a hacker submitting reports to a bug bounty program is knowing how it works on the other side and what's going on over there. So some companies, like Google, they have a huge amount of resources. They have tons of engineers dedicated to their bug bounty program. It's one of the best in the world. And then there might be another bug bounty program where they literally have one person who's in charge of IT and security is like 5% of their time.
Right.
So in a situation like that, it might take a little longer than a day or two to get a response to your report.
Yeah.
And so if you're pinging them like every hour and you're like, hey, what's going on? No, the report. That's, that sucks for them, obviously. It's not a good experience for them. And then they get irritated and then it's just a bad relationship. So
Yeah.
having a good understanding of what their resourcing is, if they have basically like a service level agreement saying we're going to try to reply to your reports within X number of days. Maybe they have that publicly available, maybe not. You can always just ask them and try to find out. There are also interesting things like, let's say you have a team that has a lot of different people that triage those reports that come in.
Yeah.
Maybe they switch off like every week. And so you submit your cross-site scripting bug on a Friday, and the switch off happens and the person just forgets to tell the next person on duty, right? And then all of a sudden 2 or 3 weeks go by and you're like, hey, why has nobody replied to my report? It just got lost in a bucket somewhere. So
Yeah.
you can be aware of things like that as well. I think, I don't know if you want to talk about it now. One thing we had chatted about was, let's say you find 5 cross-site scripting bugs in one company.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So let's say you find like a cross-site scripting bug in company A, right? And they give you some money for it. And then you find 5 more bugs, very similar cross-site scripting bugs. They pay you out for all those as well a few days later.
Yeah.
Cool. All's good. You report the same thing to another company, similar XSS, and then they take it, they say thank you, they give you, $500, whatever. You go along your merry way, you find like 10 more cross-site scripting bugs, you spend a bunch of time on this, and you submit 10
Yeah.
more to them, and they say, sorry, these are all duplicates. And you're like, what? Like, what? How
Yeah.
did that happen? So that can be really frustrating. You're like, hey, wait, company A, the first one, I had the exact same scenario. They paid me for all of them. Why are you only paying me for this first one? Like, I spent all this time. So that could actually be a reflection of how mature their bug bounty program is, Company A and Company B. So Company A, they're kind of playing whack-a-mole, and they're just paying for every report that comes their way. Company B, when they got that first cross-site scripting bug, they went and did what's called RCA, or root cause analysis.
Okay.
So they went and said, okay, we have this one cross-site scripting bug. I wonder if we have any other similar bugs. Where did this come from? Well, like,
Yeah.
what is the root cause? Basically, the name root cause analysis. And so they go and they dig through their code base and they realize, oh, we have like 20 other cross-site scripting bugs, and we can fix all of those. And so they already know. They've taken your first report. They've gone and done some investigation. They're already working on fixing the other XSS bugs you found, so they consider that to be a duplicate. Um, so overall, just knowing how things are going and how various bug bounty programs operate can help you as a hacker know how to better interact with them and develop relationships with their team.
So on that note, I'm glad you brought it up. After our conversation, I experienced something similar. It wasn't cross-site scripting, but it was this one issue where I just found it peppered throughout a site, and I wasn't sure, should I submit one report and then assume that they'll do root cause analysis, or should I just submit the 5, 10 reports that I found? Kind of, what's your advice there? Like, is it that first one? Do you ask, like, do you guys do root cause analysis, or because you don't want to waste 12 hours, 15 hours going through an entire platform only to have that happen, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna have the most terrible answer for you, and it depends. It depends. It really does. It depends on the program. Some
Yeah,
programs, like programs, do it in totally different ways. One program might reward you for all of them. One program might say, okay, give us all 20 at once, and then we're going to give you a slightly increased amount. We're not going to pay you for them individually, but because you reported all of these instances to us, we're going to pay you a little extra for that.
yeah,
So it really just depends on the program. So it never hurts to ask. Any good program will be open and transparent and will be very active in communicating back and forth and answering questions.
I've noticed
Uh,
it as well. Yeah,
One thing I can say that definitely resulted in a lot of turmoil and tears and just bad stuff was any time that a hacker made an assumption about how a program worked and like made a really big assumption, that assumption resulted in them spending lots and lots of time,
yeah,
and then that assumption was wrong, and then the company tells them they're wrong. Like nothing can make you more angry than having spent like a week on something, and
yeah,
it's like, nope, that domain is out of scope. Sorry. You're like, what? Like,
yeah. I know
why is that not on your rules
exactly.
page?
Yeah, no, it's that was yeah. It 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 sucks that there's no clear answer to it, and it's up to every program. But I've noticed that some programs are a little bit more verbose with their scope document or their policy document on HackerOne, whereas others aren't. And so I think that for any of those that are actually listening and administering a program, that really helps the hacker, right? And so
Yeah.
for those listening that are new, you should really check those out. Because I remember, this is going to be I shared in the book, might as well share it here. When I started out with HackerOne, I remember hacker, I can't think of the actual username, wrote about Yahoo having cross-site scripting in their email, right? And so it would take these HTML attributes, wouldn't parse them properly, you get cross-site scripting. So I thought, oh, I'll take that and check it out on Shopify. Did it, submitted it, felt like $1 million first time submitting a bug. Within 2 seconds, closed NA, read our scope document. We know that you can execute it right here. And I thought that was just an eye opener for me. So I hope everyone kind of learns from that. Because yeah, it sucks having that experience.
Yeah. And on the flip side, I mean, don't be afraid to reach out to a company and say, hey, like, if you have a bad experience like that, just say, hey, you should really put this in your rules page so other people like me don't have the same experience.
And yeah, I know HackerOne's been open to that because there were a couple bugs where, like, I had reported and it was like, oh no, duplicate. We're not going to address this, but it wasn't in the page, and so they updated theirs. And then there have been other programs that I've worked with where same thing. And I know that there's some other hackers working with Pornhub who had conversations with them, and then they updated their page as well. So it's a good point, and that's where again it goes back to the dialogue has to be there. And one of the things I want to talk to you about is what does a good report look like? But it has to be a respectful communication, right? I
Right.
think I've seen that in a number of reports where people get angry, get aggressive, and it doesn't help anybody. Um,
Yeah.
So on that note, from your experience, what is it for someone that's brand new to bug bounties and is going to be using the HackerOne platform? What does a good report look like from your experience? What's been something that's been good, and then what's something that's been, let's just not use the word bad, but something that's made it harder to address, say, working with an engineering team.
So the not bad but hard to address reports I think are more fun. So I'll talk about that. Um, so I think one thing I've seen, and I think a lot of bug bounty programs have felt the pain from, is something that's called the shotgun hacker.
Okay.
And the shotgun hacker is basically somebody who goes and they try to find as many things as they can, and normally that's good, right? But
Yeah.
like maybe you're using an automated scanner and you literally pull out every single finding and you don't verify it, you don't make sure it's actually a legitimate issue, and you just literally copy paste it into a report and
Yeah.
send it to the bug bounty program. That's never good, right? Because if you're the person on the other end, you're like, well, you just sent me some automated scan results. You didn't even check to see if this is a real thing or not. A
Yeah.
lot of the time, it's not a real thing. It's like you're missing X frame options on a page, and so like, okay, now you can have click jacking, but there's nothing on that page to click on. It's all static content, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's very very simple things. So those are examples of reports that you don't want to send out. You want to take the time to actually verify, if you're using an automated scanner, verify the results. So in terms of what a good report looks like, I think a good report, you really want to think from the perspective of the company. So if you're someone at the company responsible for security, you're going to want to know, okay, what is it impacting? Is it a real issue? And to determine if it's a real issue, you need really clear reproduction steps. So
Okay.
first do this, then do this, then do that. This is how you reproduce the issue. Maybe show a screenshot. And then I think one of the most important things is the impact. So
Okay.
what could I do? Like really think, what would be the end result of this bug? What's the worst case scenario
Hmm.
if a black hat hacker got a hold of this? And make sure that's spelled out very clearly in the bug so they understand. And then they
Interesting.
can hopefully reward accordingly.
Yeah. That's another. Yeah. Another topic for another day. Um, but it's interesting. You mentioned the top, like the impact, and that's something that's come up with talking with other hackers as well, and people getting providing input on the book, is spelling that out. And for me, when I approached it, like I think in the book I originally just said, use alert one, and then I got feedback. It was like, don't use alert one. That's a terrible example. Actually, think through what a malicious person could do, right? And so I think for those listening that are new, it's not to say here's what cross-site scripting is, but it's kind of here's what could be accomplished, right? And so from um, based on that, it's also looking at what different programs, like how things interact. Again, same feedback. It was information disclosure on something like Pornhub. People who are using Pornhub might be a little bit different than information disclosure on something that's public like Twitter,
Right.
right? Um, so when you're running, say, like the experience with the internet bug bounty and looking at Google, um, I don't know, I don't have much experience with Google, but there's no templates for that. So when you're looking at the impact, right? Um, like what does that mean? Like what do you want to see when you're reading a report that you're getting in? Um, because you know your own business as the company. So sometimes as a hacker, I'm going to assume you know what it means. So where does that
Mhm.
line get drawn?
Yeah, so I think Google does a good job of this, and I think other companies do. Like Uber has their treasure map, for example. So on
Yeah.
the company side of things, it's really important for the company to spell out where they care about the impact the most.
Okay.
So, for example, on Google, you might really care about mail.google.com or accounts.google.com. They actually have this laid out in their rules page, and they actually tied higher reward amounts to the domains that they care more about.
Okay.
Uh, so on the company side, I think it's the company's responsibility to say like, here's what we really care about. Here's where we want to see the impact. And on the hacker side, um, you want to think about the functionality of the program and basically what is the impact. So for example, through this cross-site scripting bug, I am able to steal your session info and I am able to gain access to XYZ.
Yeah. Okay.
Like that's an example of impact. Another thing you might want to consider, kind of on the flip side, is exploitability, right? So is this a bug that's going to require the user to do like 5 different things that are incredibly unlikely? Is the probability of exploit low? If yes, then maybe the reward might not be as much, or the reward might be non-existent. Is it something like a stored XSS where anybody who stumbles onto this page is going to get owned?
Yeah.
Then obviously the impact is a lot bigger.
Right.
So basically, think contextually about where is this vulnerability? What could you actually do with it? Why would the company think this is a really big, important issue?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and I think, yeah, I think it's becoming more and more apparent, and it's almost unfortunate. I sometimes shudder every time that it happens, but with HackerOne opening up the disclosure to any report, um, again, it's painful to read, but you can see some of the reports that really maybe you shouldn't be disclosing them because they're closed as NA or informative, and it seems like someone's requesting disclosure because they're angry. But
Mhm.
when you take a step back and I put myself in the hacker shoes, like there's no explanation for why you're reporting that or where the impact is, right?
Right.
And I think this kind of goes to speak to it. So for those that are listening and kind of up and learning how to hack, the impact is massive. And for me, I tend to try to keep a couple headers in my reports when I'm reporting to people. And now, based on feedback that I've gotten, is I usually have like a vulnerability line in there or an impact where I try to
Right.
not speak for the company, but give them an idea of from the other perspective. If I was being malicious, this is how I think I would take it and run with it. That's good advice. So, just kind of going back to kind of the questions that you and I had talked about and some of the feedback that you had provided. In terms of triaging, you had mentioned it, and I was really interested in this because I've talked to other hackers who sometimes don't have an appreciation of this. But when you're triaging, you're not necessarily the guy that's going to be fixing this. And if
Mhm.
you're at a company like Google, you could be working with, I don't know, hundreds of engineering teams, whereas some other smaller sites might not necessarily have that. So I know we talked about kind of the trade off between triagers, but what does that relationship look like when you're working with a team and say a company that's as big as Google, as opposed to say a smaller company?
Yeah. So it really depends on the company, and sometimes it's not even size. Sometimes it's just the engineering culture and how
Okay,
much do they care about security, right? Like you could have, and I'm not referring to any particular companies,
right.
right now, but you could have like a huge company who just doesn't care about security and has tons of engineers, but they don't care. It's not a priority. And you might have a small company with like 5 engineers, but they really care about security. They might actually have better turnaround times.
Yeah.
Um, so overall, if you're someone who's starting a bug bounty program for a company, there's this whole aspect of vulnerability management. A lot of the focus is on, okay, who are the hackers participating in my program? Like, what is this going to look like for my company from the PR perspective? What if something goes wrong? All of that good stuff. But a lot of the time, people forget about the tail end. So
Yeah.
if a hacker reports a vulnerability to a company, typically they're hoping that that bug's going to get fixed, right? Like
Yep.
they did it in
And get
good
paid.
faith. Yeah, they get paid, but like beyond just getting paid, hopefully there's some sort of, like I just want to be a good person and make sure that this product or service actually becomes more secure as
Yeah.
a result. And so when it comes to vulnerability management, especially when you're starting a program, you really have to account for the amount of resources you think you're going to need, and you're going to have to figure out the mappings of basically who owns what, right? Like when you get a vulnerability report, who do you give that to? If you get a report in product A, product B, product C, who is the right person to talk to make sure it gets in their workflow? What is their workflow for getting it fixed? Do they
Right.
do like sprints? Are they like an agile thing, or do they do some other model? Like how do you wed your security bug into their stack of work
Yeah.
and make sure it actually gets fixed in a timely manner? I think Colin Green actually just recently wrote a blog post that talks about this a
Yeah.
little bit. He has some really good points in there too about things like you can almost use this as leverage because it's almost public in nature. You say, hey, this is someone outside of our company who knows about the security bug and they reported it to us.
Yeah.
We have an expectation or an agreement set with them that we're going to fix it within X number of days. So like we really need your help on fixing this bug.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that just makes light bulbs just flip on in people's heads like, oh, like crap, like we gotta we gotta get on this.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it was a great post, and for both sides of the coin, I think as well, right? Because kind of what we're talking about here is like the expectation for programs and how they interact internally, right? And Colin was talking about that. He was also talking about how there's a relationship that you're building with hackers. And so one of the things that resonated with me is that hackers don't necessarily have the same knowledge that you do internally, and so there needs to be that respectful dialogue. and it goes both ways. And I think we've talked about it repeatedly here, but relationship building is huge for hacking.
Mhm.
So your time at Google and Slack, did you see that a lot? Do you see a lot of the same hackers kind of coming back to you?
Snap, it was Snapchat, not Slack.
Sorry, no,
I mean, Slack's awesome, but I
no,
have a
I knew, and I looked at. I've mentioned it a couple times, and I looked at your LinkedIn before. Maybe I'll go back and try to actually edit this. No,
no,
I won't. I'm kidding. Yeah. So,
but
uh,
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So that is something that I've seen in my experience. Is typically you have, and not just the places I've worked, but all programs I've seen. A lot of the time you have a group of like really solid top-notch hackers that you develop really good relationships with,
yeah,
and they just keep coming back and delivering solid gold over and over and over again because you have that really good relationship, you have that trust,
yeah,
and then your product, right? Because that, like you said, that relationship goes both ways. Not only does the program learn more about the hacker, but the hacker learns more about the program and how they work and
yeah.
like how they prefer the reports to come in, like what format and so on and so forth.
Hmm,
I
interesting.
think I think this Google has a blog post on this somewhere, but Google actually flew some of their top hackers out to the Zurich, Switzerland office to hang out with them and like meet them in person and visit,
Oh,
which
yeah, that is. I know that it's come up recently with DEF CON kind of happening. A lot of hackers talking about companies potentially bringing them out to DEF CON to meet, and then kind of the meetups that go on there as well. So it's interesting, and I think for those that are kind of getting into this, um, it's when you come to a platform, say like HackerOne or, in fairness, BugCrowd or some of the others, and you see this kind of plethora of programs, it's real easy to start kind of taking that shotgun approach, um, both from the I'm just going to report anything and everything I can find, but then also just bounce from program to program. And I think there's something to be said for building those relationships, because it does help again from the hacking perspective. So I think we've talked about, I think, a lot of the questions that you and I were gonna cover. Um, so for those that are new, and I'm just looking at my notes and I see it, and I've written Slack here in the notes like a jackass. So, and I think actually I emailed this to you as well. So, anyways, um, what was I going to say? Parting advice for those that are new, both from the perspective of how do you get hacking, and then kind of working with programs.
Sure. Yeah, so like I said, I haven't been too hands-on for a while, but one thing I'd recommend is get a copy of Burp Suite. It's free unless you want the paid version. That's my preferred tool of choice. It's a proxy. You can play around with things a little bit. I'd recommend checking Google Gruyere, like the cheese. So that's an
Oh
online,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's like an online code lab, and you can learn a little bit about the basics of cross-site scripting, cross forgery, things like that. Both how to protect against it and how to actually attack and find those sorts of vulnerabilities. Um, I mean, obviously, this is a prime time to plug HackerOne. So check out some programs on HackerOne. No, but joking aside, like any bug bounty program, HackerOne or otherwise, it provides a safe, legal way to just go and test your skills on stuff in the real world.
yeah,
What I can say when you're first starting to submit reports to programs, like we talked about earlier, don't be afraid to ask questions. Read the rules page really closely. Don't go and waste like a week of your life on a domain just to discover it's not in scope, and then
yeah,
you're crying sad tears of joy. Like actually check out the rules page. Don't be afraid to even before you found something. If
yeah,
you have any questions, just email, submit a report and just say, hey, I just had a question about this domain. Is it in scope? Or do you guys care about these types of bugs? And most programs are happy to answer those questions. So don't be afraid to reach out and over communicate.
nice, nice. That's awesome. Um, so yeah, on that note, I really want to say thanks for you taking the time. I appreciate it as well. I mean, I feel like I keep kind of pumping the tires, but it was awesome, right? Like Martin sent us the email, put us in communication. I didn't know what to expect. So I shot you the email and just said, hey, how's it going? Welcome. Here's a copy of the book. And then within minutes, I think you had replied. And then I think the amount of just the text that you were providing was mind-boggling because it started opening so many doors for me to improve the book. So I really appreciate that and you taking the time for the interview. So thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So on that note, probably just going to stop the interview here. Hacking Pro Tips number 4, Adam Bacchus. Hopefully we'll see everybody for Hacking Pro Tips number 5, which should be coming out soon. And I've got a couple others lined up, which will be interesting as well. So thanks very much for listening.